On Tuesday, a Manhattan federal grand jury found that former President Donald Trump is civilly liable for sexual assault that occurred in a case involving Jean Carroll in a New York department store back in 1996. I'm Tim Darnell, and this is a special live stream on our Atlanta News First digital platforms, including YouTube, Apple TV, Roku, and Amazon Fire. And we're joined in our Midtown Atlanta studios by one of the most renowned pollsters in not only Georgia, but the United States, and Mark Roundtree, president of Landmark Communications of Georgia. And Mark, thanks for coming in. We're here to talk about how this civil verdict of up to $5 million in damages could affect the election here in Georgia. Georgia is a battleground state, really continues to be the center of the nation's political universe. How is all this going to play out between now and November 2024, which admittedly is a lifetime in terms of politics?
Well, for the last few years, of course, Donald Trump has both inflicted and suffered tremendous political damage in all directions on people and against him. Over that time period, his numbers really have not changed. He lost the 2020 election by not a big change in numbers from the 2016 election. The question is, does new news, do new revelations about him change the environment, the political environment for a number of voters, enough voters to change the election? I think in the big picture, what's going to happen is we're not going to see a lot of changes in the political landscape in the sense of the macrocosm. In terms of the entire United States, in terms of the whole population, I think it's sort of baked in the cake that they understand that Trump, after all of the impeachments, all of the lawsuits, the congressional investigations, I think they understand he has an aggressive behavior. But I think there's also a significant part of the country that sees him as somewhat of a gladiator. They see that American civilization, as we have known it traditionally, is at stake, and they forgive some of the shortcomings. I don't think this is going to have a big picture effect on poll numbers or on Trump, but I do think on a state-by-state basis, which we can chat about, I think on a state-by-state basis it could have some negative impact.
And on a state-by-state basis, we were talking before we went on air.
Yes.
We're talking about presidential elections that effectively can be decided by only a few tens of thousands of people in each state. In Georgia, arguably, Georgia is what propelled Joe Biden into the White House. And yet President Trump continues to have strong support here in Georgia. Poll after poll have shown him not only strong here in Georgia, but nationally. But let's talk about that fraction of voters in the center that can truly swing a presidential election and make history one way or the other.
So when President Biden won the election in 2020, and by the way, when I say that, let's set aside the question for a moment of counting votes and what happened with that. But on the official books, President Biden won that election. And he only flipped 5 states away from Trump. And those states went by a very small margin toward Biden. So, for example, in Georgia, it was a little more than 11,000 votes. Wisconsin was another very close state. You're talking about 3/10 of a percentage point, 4/10 of a percentage point. Arizona, 2/10 of a percentage point that Biden won by. Pennsylvania, it was only 60,000 votes, give or take, out of millions of votes. So you're talking about very sliver-like margins of victory. In these particular states, this kind of impact might be different because this is the new news kind of approach that has now happened that we hadn't seen. You hadn't seen Trump basically convicted is the wrong word, but held liable. And in these types of states, it may matter.
And let's talk about those states in Georgia. This morning, Wednesday morning, President Biden and Vice President Harris announced members of their reelection campaign advisory board. Mayor Andre Dickens, U.S. Senator Raphael Warnock, both strong supporters of the administration, were the only two Democrats from Georgia named to the advisory board. The board being chaired by former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi of California, composed of a lot of Democrats from California, the Midwest, and the industrial Northeast. President Biden had a chance really to move Georgia to the political forefront when the city of Atlanta was being considered as a site for the 2024 DNC. He chose instead, and the Democratic Party chose Chicago. Was that a recognition that perhaps Georgia isn't as strong a Democratic stronghold as President Biden and the party would hope to, or are hoping to believe?
I don't think the internal appointments of well-known political figures matters at all in moving the needle on winning and losing elections, and I don't think it draws Biden any closer to Georgia. I think it was a significant mistake that the Democratic National Party did not make Georgia their site for their convention. Picking Chicago simply because, call it what you will, they got a lot of state funding to do that, I think is a mistake because it was not an ad. There was no value added to picking Chicago, especially with the crime problems and the tax problems and the loss of economic growth that has happened there. They should have picked Georgia. Now, that's done, it's set aside. I don't think that picking Pelosi and Warnock and basically retreads that have run campaigns before, that doesn't say anything to the average voter. If they were to go out and find people that might be considered a little bit surprising, that might be fun. What if they were to go out and what if Biden had gone out and picked a Matthew McConaughey or somebody like that to chair it? That would actually get some news and that would actually get some interest. But I think it says that Biden is going to run basically the same kind of campaign he ran before with the same surroundings. These are the same people that were involved in 2020. It's not that they're bad. I just don't think that they add anything to the political equation for Biden.
We were speculating after the announcement came that Chicago is the host for the 2024 convention, that perhaps President Biden and the Democratic Party were really kind of playing it safe rather than picking a more progressive or more inspired choice like Atlanta and Georgia for the site of the convention. He felt safer picking Chicago, surrounded by the quote-unquote blue wall. Does not picking Atlanta and not picking Georgia and not taking these kind of politically maybe risky but more enlightened choices, does that dim the Democratic prospects here in Georgia?
Well, I think Trump is in a better position in Georgia than he was 4 years ago. Now, in Georgia, I do have to say, or 3 years ago, but I do have to say, we don't know ultimately the impact of the ruling yesterday, or the finding by the jury, we should say. But I tend to think that, like I said before, on a national scale, there's not going to be a lot of movement in the surveys that are going on and in public opinion. But on a case-by-case basis, meaning state by state, there could be slivers of movement, and we just have to see. And that will primarily come from suburban women, educated suburban women in the North Atlanta suburbs. That could be a problem. This does not help Trump's case with making a case to those voters that he has re-earned their support. The other cities to sort of look at, the Phoenix area, this doesn't help with educated suburban women in the Phoenix area. Wisconsin, the same thing. The Philadelphia metro area, suburban area, these are the places where Trump has to do better. And he doesn't have to do a whole lot better, but he does have to do a little better. This ruling doesn't help, or this finding doesn't help.
In terms of where this jury verdict was delivered, there's been tons of news over the past couple of months coming out of Manhattan and Manhattan grand juries. We all know that Trump is the first ex-president to ever be criminally indicted, and yet here is a jury awarding $5 million in civil damages to a case that happened back in the in the 1990s. Does the location of the jury and where the verdict actually happened, does that play a role?
I think it does have an impact, and it sort of mitigates the finding. I'm not making when I say that, understand, I'm not making a statement on the finding itself, whether it was right or wrong or anything like that. I'm making the point that because this is a New York City jury, it's a New York jury, I think it helps Trump in a sense politically, because people will discount the location of the jury. I think they automatically assume that this was a tilted case against him to some degree. Now, if this finding had been in Kansas or Alabama, that might be a surprise. That might be a more damaging finding. But it was a New York jury. And I think on a political level, I'm not talking about the legal level, but on a political level, that does mitigate the political damage to some degree, yes.
If Fulton County District Attorney Fonnie Willis does issue some sort of criminal indictments, regardless of what they are, she has said that we can expect some sort of announcement sometime around June, July. I think the deadline that she gave was between now and July 11th. She has until May 15th to respond to another request from Fulton County Superior Court Judge Robert McBurney. If Fonnie Willis does issue some sort of criminal indictments this summer, how will this play out in the battleground state of Georgia, do you think?
Well, I think it's pretty clear from the beginning that she has been very focused on getting an indictment. I don't think there was ever a circumstance where she was not going to go after an indictment. She's pursued this too aggressively. She's very much funded. She's spent disproportionate amounts of funds of her office focusing on this case, to the point where she had to go seek additional millions of dollars from the county commission, getting those approved so that she could even continue cases, other cases that are basically were thrown in her lap. She has a serious backload of cases. So I think the fact that it's a Fulton County District Attorney, again, does discount it. However, what's different here is that's a criminal case. A criminal case is going to be viewed very much differently, I think, than a civil case. A civil case in New York City is not going to be the same as a criminal case in Georgia. I do think she has, from the beginning, pursued indictments. I think she decided she was going to do this from the beginning, and I think it's pretty much borne out that way, the way this has been handled.
You said that there's going to be a difference between a New York criminal case and a Fulton County criminal case. How so?
Well, I think Georgia being much more of a swing state, New York is not a swing state. It's going to be considered politically liberal and anti-Trump. I think to some degree the fact that it's a criminal case in Georgia, that has a different weight than a jury finding for a civil case.
When speaking to any voter out there who really would not like to see a Trump-Biden rematch in 2024, for voters who are tired of the drama playing out between the two campaigns, do we have any hope? or do those voters have any hope for any challengers or any realistic options in terms of 2024 presidential candidates?
The fact that we're continuing day by day to talk about Trump and Biden, it makes it very difficult. It's filling up all the oxygen in the room, these conversations, and it makes it very hard for Governor DeSantis in Florida, Nikki Haley in South Carolina, and some of the other folks that are running to try to fill the void. With that being said, a lot of times third-party successes, they don't start successfully, so to speak. They don't start 6 months to a year in advance. Third-party success and challengers that come from out of nowhere usually emerge in the final 30 days. The question is the runway here. Is there enough runway for a Ron DeSantis who has raised well in excess of $100 million already for this race? He is a formidable candidate. I think the case with Trump, both in Atlanta and in the criminal case in Atlanta and the civil case in New York, have kind of made it difficult for him to get traction, and he's decided to stay on the sidelines. I think he's about to enter the race. I do think that his numbers will start to move from the mid-20s probably into the low 30s by the fall. And if they're not, then he will have trouble. with that being said, right now this is a 20-point lead that Trump has.
Right.
It appears pretty consistently, regardless of which polling firm you're looking at. You have Trump in the 40s and you have DeSantis in the 20s. DeSantis is not going to lead until he gets in the race. He's held out probably a little bit long at this point, I think.
Does Ron DeSantis need the support of Georgia Republican leaders like Brian Kemp to make his campaign a success here in Georgia?
I think it's essential that he win Georgia. I don't think there's a scenario that DeSantis doesn't win if he doesn't win the South. And his political problem right now is that he's known on culture issues. He's culturally conservative. He's had, basically what is now tantamount to a war with Disney. You have if you remember the Martha's Vineyard trips from a year ago where he sent illegal immigrants, it flew them to Martha's Vineyard, dropped them off, and let other people deal with the expense and the problem, which was humorous and put him on the map. On the other hand, a lot of those voters are already going to be very satisfied with Trump if those issues appeal to you. There is a margin here I would watch for a Nikki Haley type campaign. She's the former governor of South Carolina. She was well regarded when she was at the UN as ambassador. She is going to be here actually in June. She will be, if memory serves, she's going to be at a home of State Representative Deborah Silcox to do a meet and greet in the North Atlanta area. There is a margin for a third candidate to emerge that kind of hails not so much on the culture war side of things, but on the economic side. And I would be watching that. With all that being said, Trump takes up about 50% of the vote. Call it what you will. It's 45%. It's going to be very difficult for three candidates to hold out very long if his numbers hold. And right now, based on this New York jury finding, I don't think those numbers are changing right now.
If you were to advise a President Biden or Donald Trump or Nikki Haley or a Ron DeSantis or any presidential hopeful for 2024 in terms of how to win here in Georgia, what would it be?
You have to do something that's different. And if you remember, former Georgian Herman Cain ran for president, temporarily led the polls in Iowa and was leading nationally by half a dozen points. He was mainly known for a variation of the fair tax. The fair tax is an idea that has been pushed in Georgia, perhaps more than other states. It is basically tantamount to the permanent elimination of the income tax, replacing it with a national sales tax. There's more to it than that, but that is kind of the messaging of it. An idea like that, or a similar sort of sweeping economic issue, would be huge. Here's a question I would have for any presidential candidate, any congressional candidate. Why, after Republicans have controlled the Congress and the presidency at various points, why has the balanced budget amendment never been passed? It's overwhelmingly popular. That's another one. Just call for, I don't think you can do a national referendum per se, but you could do a state-by-state referendum. I think a candidate who consistently goes with things like the balanced budget amendment, maybe the fair tax, these sorts of ideas, I think would have overwhelming support.
Those kind of economic populist, more populist related issues, why aren't candidates focusing more on those as opposed to the cultural issues, such as what's happening in Disney and the quote-unquote woke movement? Is that simply a way to appeal to the party's base?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. People don't go around wearing stickers very often that say, I support the fair tax. But they will engage in conversations and they will post memes on social media. They will engage on things that are quick hits, like what's going on with Disney, this battle with Disney. And setting aside who's right and wrong and all of that, it's a quick hit way to kind of make known to the public where you stand on issues. It's harder to do that, and it's easier to demagogue things like the fair tax or the balanced budget amendment. So it's a little bit harder to make those issues known. But I believe that in a Republican primary in particular, there's going to be a lot of support for that. I think actually it would be something that if President Biden were to run on a tiered in, not an immediate, but a tiered in balanced budget amendment that where he would take the role of being the one who balances the federal budget and allows for exemptions and allows for situations, but basically tiering it in. I think it would be a masterstroke on that team's part to get reelected, because I think the biggest fear people have, if they really have, when you set aside all of the issues right now, is I think a lot of people sense that American civilization as we once knew it is at stake. And that's why people are getting more polarized and they're standing behind their gladiator no matter how damaged they are, because they sense that the other team, again, right or wrong, they sense the other team would be damaging, so damaging to the country that it would be irreversible. So I think an issue like that would take the country by storm, particularly if Biden were to grab it. I wouldn't expect him to, but that would be something that would be newsworthy.
And the gladiatorial combat is going to continue to play out right here in Georgia. We are wrapping up this live edition of Atlanta News First on our digital streaming platforms from our Midtown Atlanta studios with Mark Roundtree, president of Landmark Communications, talking about the impact, the electoral impact on the verdict on Tuesday that found former President Donald Trump liable for up to $5 million in damages in regards to a sexual abuse case in a New York department store. Mark, final thoughts for our viewers and listeners to consider.
Yes, I just would reiterate that I don't think these poll numbers are going to move in the macrocosm. You might see a point or two, but I think what you might see, I think it's going to be important to look state by state. Presidential elections are not won on national polls. We sort of know that, but we simultaneously forget that. It's going to be won or lost in basically 5 states. This is a 5-state election. Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin. I would look to Pennsylvania. It was only a 0.2% margin last time. Not 2%, 0.2%. I think these are states, look at North Carolina. These are the states that are going to determine the next president of the United States. What's happened in the news in the last 24 hours does not help President Trump if he's trying to consolidate moderate Republicans to come his way. But it is a 1.5-year-long campaign to go, assuming he's renominated, if he is, and there's going to be a lot more happening down the road, particularly with the criminal investigation in Atlanta and how that is perceived by the country.
And we're going to continue to cover all of those issues here on Atlanta News First. Thanks to Mark Roundtree, president of Landmark Communications. Thanks to all of you for watching.